49, section 2, number 12. It is primarily by raising interest rates that central bankers curb inflation, but an increase in interest rates takes up to 2 years to affect inflation. So I'm thinking, all right, so you'd have to do it ahead of time. Accordingly, central bankers usually try to raise interest rates before inflation becomes excessive, at which time inflation is not yet readily apparent either. But unless inflation is readily apparent, interest rate hikes generally will be perceived as needlessly restraining a growing economy. This is like totally true. Like this is just exactly every economic political debate, okay? The Federal Reserve is constantly trying to control inflation by raising interest rates, but they always want to raise interest rates while the economy is doing well and there is no inflation, because they're trying to, they want to lead so that we can avoid inflation. Got it. Thus, central bankers' success in temporarily restraining inflation may make it harder for them to ward off future inflation without incurring the public's wrath. I get that. Like if they bump interest rates today and then we don't have inflation, the next time they want to bump interest rates, people are going to be like, what are you doing? We never have inflation. And they're like, I know, that's because we're so awesome at managing it. Which one of the following most accurately describes the role played in the argument by the claim that it is primarily by raising interest rates that central bankers curb inflation? Okay, on this type of question, this role question, I always say, is it the conclusion, or is it a premise in support of the conclusion, or is it something else? Here, the conclusion was the better central bankers get at controlling inflation, the more people are going to get mad at them when they try to control inflation. I think the claim that it's primarily by raising interest rates that central bankers curb inflation, it's like background information. I suppose you could call it a premise if you wanted. A, it's presented as a complete explanation. No, it's not an explanation of Jack. It's just the background. It's like, here's what we're talking about. It's a topic. It's not an explanation. Certainly not a complete explanation. B, it's a description of a phenomenon for which the claim that an increase in interest rates takes up to 2 years to affect inflation is offered as an explanation. No. It was a premise that doesn't have any support. It was just like background information. Hey, raising interest rates is the primary tool that central bankers use to control inflation. They didn't provide any evidence for that or try to explain why they do that. They just said, here's a fact. C, it's a premise offered in support of the conclusion that central bankers' success in temporarily restraining inflation may make it harder for them to ward off future inflation without incurring the public's wrath. I do think it's a premise. I also think that C correctly describes the conclusion of the argument. So I'll be surprised if C is not the answer. D, it is a conclusion. No, it's not, it's a premise. E, it is a premise offered in support of the conclusion that unless inflation is readily apparent, interest rate hikes generally will be perceived as needlessly restraining a growing economy. No, I think E is describing something that's a totally separate premise. I don't think central bankers use interest rates to curb inflation supports the idea that unless inflation is readily apparent, interest rate hikes generally will be perceived. Nah, that's just misdescribing the logic of the argument. The answer is C.